I'm Lisa Gibson, marketing for ReWired Fest. Thank you for coming. I am pleased to announce the From Code to Content panel, the life cycle of game development. I'm going to introduce first Mr. David Frederick, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with many times. He is director of the Tesseract Center for Immersive Environments and Game Design. That's a long title. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, you did great.
Okay, great. Next up, I'm going to introduce Brianna Jenkins, art director of Causeway Studios. That's a much easier title. Come on up, Brianna, and grab a microphone. And also Curtis Mon, director of World Languages and Digital Humanities Studio, University of Arkansas. Come on up. By the way, I'm a liberal arts major, so I'm super excited to learn what this has to do with gaming. Lastly, I'm introducing Joe Payne, founding partner of Gravity Turn and co-founder Society of the Hourglass. All right, I'm going to turn this over. Thank you.
Thank you. Sound good. So thank you so much for that introduction, Lisa. And so what we're going to talk about, it's going to be a little bit different than what the title suggests, in that we're going to address why this is such an important, powerful moment for video games. Powerful for education, powerful for industry. Certainly there's esports, which is a huge thing, but there's also the world of indie games, which is super important for issues of inclusion and diversity. So that's kind of where we're going to head. And so why is this such a powerful moment for video games? One thing is that they now outgross film and movies combined. And so they are the largest grossing form of entertainment on the planet. That's super important. The other thing is the tools to make video games have become so much more accessible than a decade ago. So with things like Unity and Unreal, there's so many more developers than there ever have been in the past. And that's definitely connected with why we have so many indie games and so many kinds of developers. And that includes what we think of as underrepresented groups in game development, because we're getting game developers that are Black, that are brown, BIPOC, LGBTQ+. These are extremely important voices in game development. So these things are converging, and certainly another part of that is game engines are now used for a lot of things outside of games. And so things like digital twins, like 3D recreations of something in the real world, right, that you can play through experience in that 3D virtual space before you actually deliver that product to market or to support the delivery of that product, right? And that is a huge thing for instance, the automotive industry. So games are a big deal, game engines outside of games, right? So that's a very important thing to keep an eye on for how we educate and what we educate for. So these things are all converging now to make this an extremely important moment for video games, even though we're like, yeah, games are huge. That's right, and they're even huger than we think they are. So we're going to talk about that and what we sort of think the future perspective is on that, because now we have things like blockchain, NFTs, Web3, right? That's going to impact how games get made and how they get published and what sort of games we get to play. So there's a lot happening right now, which we are going to run through in this panel, so I'm super excited about that. So the first thing I think to do is to pose the question, I'll just go down the line to Bree and Curtis and Joe, like what got you into games? Like why have games become such a critical part of like who you are and what you do professionally, and those things aren't necessarily the same thing, right? But why games for you?
Yeah, so I think my earliest experience with video games was playing Diddy Kong Racing with my brother on the N64. And I think from that point, I was pretty much hooked. Growing up, just the worlds that games allowed me to experience, the community I was able to find online, in MMOs, in like fan circles around different video games, it just impacted me pretty significantly. And now I make games, again, because I love to be able to bring these creative worlds to life. So I hope to be able to create more narratives, especially diverse narratives, and impact people like I was impacted.
So I've always loved playing games, but it wasn't until I started teaching world languages, in my case German, and then bringing games into the classroom and seeing just the incredible potential they have for teaching and for learning. Not just having students play games, but having students make games, even in a language learning context. And so that was a very exciting moment for me as a teacher. I then made my way to the Cologne Game Lab, which is a game design institute in Germany. And there I learned about all the really exciting interconnections between game research, game pedagogy, and game development. And I'm taking all that experience with me here to the University of Arkansas. Really happy to be on the team here now.
Hey, everybody. So I guess my game journey started when I was 5 years old. I got a Nintendo Entertainment System, OG, for Christmas, and I haven't put the controller down since. So, you know, I'm actually relatively new on the builder side of the game industry. So it's kind of a coming full circle for me. You know, when I was graduating high school, I wanted to go to college for this, and you know, lots of different reasons it didn't work out. But I'm a big believer in serendipity, and you know, I think that the experiences that I got going out and focusing on user experience and design, and now moving into entrepreneurship, and now on the venture side with Gravity Turn, where we're trying to back and support entrepreneurs building and creating games, especially on the indie side. I think indie developers are often a really good place to look for signals of what's coming. So that's kind of where we're placing our bets, and I'm trying to just sponge up and learn as much as I possibly can. I'm excited to be along for the ride.
Yeah, and I think you can probably sense that for all of us, it's like once we got into games, it's like, how are we going to stop? Like, it's so compelling, and certainly compelling to be a developer. And my journey is real weird. I mean, I played like Pong. So that's a long time ago. And then I played like Star Wars Battlefront and Battlefield 1942 with my son. And I was the person trapped in the Quonset hut. Like, and I'd get shot every time I stuck my head out the door because he could fly helicopters. So I was not what you'd call a gifted gamer by any stretch. But for me, I got into video game development very weirdly by being interested in art history. So you wondered, like, as a liberal arts person, what's the connection? So I wanted to recreate, like, the impact of artwork in ancient Pompeian houses. Like, I wanted to experience that. And right as I was like, how do you do that in real time? And like, it was like the mid-2000s, and that's when the Unity game engine appeared on the scene. And I like saw that it played 3D immersive content on your web browser. That is, I was like, oh, that's going to change education so much, so strongly, that I just had to take that left turn from being a classicist of all things to being a game designer. So I started an on-campus game studio, which Bree worked at, and I had at one point a team of 25 people. It was the most crazy, intense ride. And as a teacher, it's certainly the most rewarding. And a lot of that has to do with what games are. Because they're art, they're coding, there's story, and there's what the player does. That player interaction part, that's extremely interdisciplinary, and it's just profoundly so. So that really got hold of me as an educator, and like beyond that, as a person. And I think, like, if you're passionate, and also indie games. Like, when I started to get back into playing games, and I played games like What Remains of Edith Finch, that game, like, that is an art piece for sure. And I'm like, super powerful. So that really got hold of me, and I think we share that passion, and that this can change education, it can change industry, and that's really cool. So my first question, and it's like, you can see we're kind of a diverse panel in where we come from and why we're interested in games. So these questions, I'm going to throw them out there, like, to the panel, and we'll see who jumps on them. So my first question for the panel is, besides education and besides entertainment, what industries do you think, like video games in real-time 3D, are going to impact?
I'll jump in on part of that. So one of the things that I personally get really excited about is the practical application of things like augmented reality. There's a lot of talk of AR and VR, and Meta has obviously been making a bunch of moves in that space. I think personally, at least for the next 10 years or so, probably augmented reality is going to be a lot more practical and broadly applicable than virtual reality. At least just at a consumer level, right? I think there are probably specialty applications where that's maybe not the case, but when you think about all of the skills required to bring really immersive, compelling, augmented experiences to life. Right now we experience most of those through like our phones. I don't think it's outside the realm of reality to imagine a future, probably not that far down the line, where we laugh at the idea of carrying phones around because we have wearables that, like, that's how we're communicating and experiencing all of this kind of thing. And so, whether it's Unity, 3D, sound design, like all of those things play a role in that augmented experience. And whether you're applying that to entertainment or shopping or navigation, tourism, like all of those things have really, really interesting use cases. So to your point, like it's gaming outside the context of gaming. I think in general, the idea of gamifying experiences still has a lot of room to explore. Right? I think we've just scratched the surface of some of those as we see technology as a whole just continue to like exponentially accelerate in innovation and change. So I get really excited when I like imagine the world we're going to be living in 5-10 years down the road.
I would add on to that. A game engine will make a replica in a digital 3D space of your BMW before you build that BMW. And if you used to sculpt your BMW with 4,000 pounds of clay, like to figure out whether you really like the design at that scale, but instead now, for instance, with VR, like you did that and you didn't have to use all that clay, and you had those assets ready for a game engine from the start of your design process, so when it's time to move your car, right, it exists in that world and can be sold to the consumer who wants to experience that car before they're going to be able to buy it. So that is like a product that's born with this digital twin in mind, and that helps move the whole process. That is indeed what is happening with game engines, both Unreal and Unity. If you want to do a film shoot and you want to imagine where all your cameras need to go on that street in New York City, and you map that street out in a game engine, those virtual cameras will tell you a lot about that before you ever get there. So your one day on site is now suddenly maximized in a way it never could be before. So what if you want to have an operating room, but you want the doctors to assess, like the surgeons need to know, is this going to work? And you make that in a virtual space, they're like, no, that table's clearly 3 feet too far away from me. Right? All of these questions can be answered through a digital twin made in a game engine, which is why there's now a 650% annual job growth in 3D skills that are not making games, but are real-time 3D skills. And that's like, if you're an educator at the University of Arkansas, that has to mean a thing or two to you. So that's how I see it, and it's super exciting because that means like game engines, some of us are making games, some of us are addressing PTSD through VR applications. So many things that are real-world problems and processes are being improved by this reach of games and game engines.
Yeah, I think that's the term that you used, digital twin, is so key here. And we had metaverse as well. And Kevin Kelly, the technologist, co-founder of Wired, he uses the term mirror world, that there's a digital overlay to everything that we're doing, and we're slowly starting to see it. We're seeing it through augmented reality. We're seeing it through VR. And so do we want to have our students exist in that space and consume in that space and kind of passively, be inundated with all the players already in that space, or do we want to empower them so that they can design that space and improve that space? I think that's, this notion of a digital overlay, everything is going to be impacted by gaming, game design, and by teaching those things, we give students the chance to actually engage with that space instead of passively receiving it.
Yeah. Okay. So a follow-up question on that is, what about education specifically? Like, how are games, video games, and game engines going to impact education, and I guess especially higher education, but not only that? For instance, over the next 5 years, and I think we're at that moment where it used to be like, if kids are video gaming, they're not studying, therefore they're not learning, and therefore video games are bad for education. And that's through the work of a lot of people. James G. especially maybe has really come under a lot of correction. And that is, video games have to be really good at teaching their players really fast, otherwise you put down the game. Right? So there's a lot to learn about learning by playing a video game and designing video games. So I think education itself is going to be really impacted and transformed by that. And I'll just say, I just don't see a world in which 5 years from now we're using 2D textbooks a whole bunch, right? If that can be a 3D immersive experience of whatever it is you're trying to teach, or at least enhanced by that, that's way stronger than this buy a $300 textbook from whoever, right? And whatever it is, chemistry, physics, whatever, history, can be so much enriched by 3D content that's immersive. So I see for me, I see like a lot of potential for transformation there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you were saying, it can really enhance the way that we're learning by making the content more engaging and more immersive. So for history, you could literally take a student, well, digitally literally, take a student to that place or that time period. So for time period, like in a way that's never been possible before. You can create more relatable, like scientific models that we normally see just in a 2D format. There's so many ways that using game engines to make immersive experiences can enhance and improve the learning process. And you touched on this a little bit, beyond just using games to teach content, having students actually make games in order to learn the content. So having them make games about a point in history requires them to really internalize the information at a deeper level, because when you're making a game about something, you have to connect on it with art, with code, with the design, in so many ways, as well as collaborate interdisciplinary, which is a super important skill in this day and age.
Yeah, super. That was one of the most intense things about the game studio on campus that I directed, was the quality, intensity, passion of that interdisciplinary work that students did. You know, and it can't, like, sometimes educators are cynical about what an undergraduate can do. And watching them in action in that lab would remove that cynicism, right? Because there was so much growth. And I think that's partly, we knew we were making real things, like digital things, but for real applications. And just the growth in terms of communication, interdisciplinary communication, soft skills to get the thing made. So there's a lot that benefits education in the game making process for sure. So I think, and as we start to piece these things together, another question comes up that was part of the panels this morning also, and that is, why is it so important for their like underrepresented groups to be involved in that game making process? And if we can drive that involvement of underrepresented groups as storytellers, like globally, so like indigenous storytellers, like this game Never Alone, a fantastic game. So what can we do to involve and broaden the people who have access to making games? And of course that speaks to education. So, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think all the big picture ideas we've been hearing all morning, all the hope for the video game medium, from connectivity, community, authenticity, none of that is possible if we do not have diversity in game development. None of it's possible. It has to start there. And so what's one way to do that? Well, the private sector can adjust a bit. There can be changes made on that end, but also on the end of academia, right? We can help with the education part and make game development accessible to our students. We can lead the way as being part of a university, but we should then also be in touch with K through 12. It should start there. And learning to make games will just become a part of broad education broadly, just in the same way that games are a part of pretty much everything that we do now. And that learning to design, learning to understand that you can be a part of this process and not just on the receiving end of it, right? I think is absolutely crucial for our students. We want to empower them.
Yeah, so I think that is, and I think also the stereotype about games, that is that they're played by white people and made by white people and for people who already have money and people who can afford high-end gaming rigs. A lot of this is open to challenge these days, and I think one of those areas of challenge is what happens when really quality gaming experiences are accessible through the web because we're just about at that point, right? So web-delivered 3D content, we already have obviously games on your phone, right? But this speaks to a critical infrastructure thing, and that is connectivity, like high-speed connectivity. So we have all of this at our fingertips seemingly in games, but if we want there to be kids in rural Arkansas developing games, they got to have high-speed internet, right? So this becomes a critical equity issue. And I think it's one, like, we've got to start thinking about these as solvable problems. And as was mentioned, one of the panels, somebody said, like, games are inherently a problem-solving thing. And that creativity that you find when you like get kids together and they're making games, and they don't care about disciplinary like differences, like they're not a department at a university, you know, they're kids. And that the intensity of their drive to create, right? Their sense of, oh, it's like problem solving when I play a game, but this is a more intense form, making the game, of problem solving. If we can unleash some of that towards some of the, for instance, infrastructure questions that we have, games can actually, because of the way they engage problem solving, actually help us move towards solutions like things, well, if we wanted to look at a system in Arkansas, high-speed internet, how could we address how that gets distributed? If you can have people thinking in game-like ways about that, you drive much more innovative potential solutions to those issues. So that's super important. So I think the next question is, like much of the Midwest and South, Arkansas is underrepresented in game development. How might this be changed, and with what benefits to the state of Arkansas?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I think connectivity is one of the first steps, having high-speed internet available in our schools. Trying to kind of bridge the gap of the resources available to build digital literacy in the state, because there's a pretty big disparity between different parts of the state. And, you know, the result of doing that is to have students that have a higher digital literacy, have students that can kind of explore their passions through that to know what they want to do. So if they're, you know, able to go to college, they're better prepared for that, and better able to enter a workforce, hopefully locally.
Yeah, that's a big one locally. That's because right now, Tesseract, we had really talented students. I want to call them kids, but they're not kids anymore. And so they went through this game design studio on our campus, and now one is, you know, like a programmer at Retro Studios, Nintendo's major North American studio. One is at Armature Studios, Resident Evil 4 for VR. He was a lead developer on that. People at Microsoft. I mean, people from Arkansas can definitely compete in this space if we give them the tools. They're like, this is really important. We have a governor who had coding as a required subject introduced into our high schools. If you really want to drive kids, like you want them to code passionately, give them a game engine. That's sort of the next step there. Is like, we can make that, let's have all the kids code. That's an excellent idea. Let's have them not only code, but let's have them work in an interdisciplinary way around a game engine. That is, to me, that's like the next step for like 7th, 8th, 9th grade education, Minecraft to Unity. And by the time those kids get to the University of Arkansas, they're already excellent coders. Like, and they've already worked on interdisciplinary teams. So to me, that seeing that potential for the state is super exciting.
And I think events like this one, like the ReWired Festival, also play a critical role in this. I think about the Cologne Game Lab where I worked and spent 3 years there. And you know, Cologne is now a spot in the international game development scene, but it didn't have to be. Berlin was always the powerhouse in Germany, but Cologne kind of muscled its way in by hosting things like Gamescom and the Clash of Realities. These are big conferences, and the Clash of Realities is especially interesting because that was started by Electronic Arts and the University of Applied Sciences of Cologne. And I see kind of that same sort of synergy happening here, and that's really, really exciting to put, you know, the game development industry in touch with the academy, in touch with local government. I mean, it's that sort of synergy that can lead to that change I think you're pointing toward, Dave.
Yeah, and I think next ReWired Fest, how we should have a game jam, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Like with a big prize. So that would be super fun. So I think we can think now also about the fact that the web itself is changing. And so we have Web3, blockchain, NFTs are all entering, certainly becoming impactful in the world of games for sure. And as the web, and I think we've talked about another morphing of the web, and that is like 3D web content that's native in your browser. Like if you think about that, we've all been taught to absorb this metaphor of a web page that we scroll through, like these pages. What if you opened a website, like you probably all have shopped, like at Amazon and Walmart, like they have digital things, there's like a field of product in boxes, like little squares on your screen, and maybe it rotates if you're lucky. Like that's it. What if you just walked into that world? Like you want to buy a kayak and you just walk into the world and test that kayak out, like with no barriers, right in your web browser. You don't have to download anything or do anything like that. So rather than a web page, a web space. And we are not far from that. And as soon as web pages become web spaces, that is 3D interactive spaces, that's a game world. So you can imagine the kind of talent that we need. And you can probably also imagine that retail cares about that, right? Because they want to tell their brand stories in an interactive, immersive 3D space. You just have to think a little bit about the demand for 3D talent, game design talent that will generate, right? So we're right on, that's like makes now such an important moment for video games. And with that, I think it's a good, fair question. How do we see Web3, NFT, blockchain affecting game development, game distribution?
I'll go.
Yeah, you should go.
Yeah, so this is an area that I get super fired up about, and I know it's interesting, right? Because there's a lot of kind of, I think, misperceptions and even like controversy around the idea of blockchain technology and Web3, particularly in the gaming industry. It's a very, I think, misguided conversation and focal point. It would be like, you know, everyone that's done a Google search sitting around and arguing about the protocol that Google uses behind the scenes to query searches. Like, it's just ridiculous that we would look at it like that. It's just an infrastructure conversation. You know, the things that I get excited about when you think about what Web3 at its core and what blockchain technology at its core can do in the realm of things like player-owned economies and like actually owning the assets in games that I play. And not just from a monetary perspective, although that's certainly a part of it, right? But when you layer that on top of infrastructure and opportunity, you know, creating like real possibilities for people that maybe didn't have access to some of these worlds to participate and monetize their time, like that gets really interesting and exciting. But also just the whole perspective of not only owning the assets, but you know, even from a developer standpoint, brands being able to participate in the secondary markets on assets that, you know, they, from a business perspective, that's revenue they've missed out on historically, right? Because these secondary markets exist, they always have in games. It's just now, instead of, you know, working a black market deal where I PayPal you money and you send me your username and login. We have like a systematically supported infrastructure to make those kinds of exchanges. You know, there's lots of use cases for thinking about how Web3 is going to change the way that we distribute and interact with technology. Right now, there's still a lot of friction around even getting involved in the space, which is a big part of the problem. You know, a lot of the conversation has been dominated in the last couple of years by just rampant financial speculation, which has not done it any favors. I think over time, all of that will go away. It'll be a part of it, right? Just like it is in literally any other technological advancement that has happened in the past. You know, in some ways, you need those kind of like Wild West degens to kind of push progress forward. For me, I got to see the internet kind of come up as a kid, like participating and learning about what websites are. You know, I very fundamentally believe blockchain technology is that level of a paradigm shift coming again. This time, though, I'm going to participate in it on the creator side. So that's really exciting for me. And when you think about, you're talking about access earlier, people around the world, as things like broadband become more pervasive, people have the ability to kind of come in and participate in these economies and make a living in ways that weren't previously available. Like, all of those things are really, really interesting to me. And I just think, again, we're so early in all of this, whether it's Web3 or augmented reality or virtual reality. I think even those of us that are in the space, like building in it, are like just scratching the surface of the potential.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that I think is really cool to think about, is like, what are the things we don't know yet, and the use cases we haven't found, that's going to change how we think about this.
I'm just curious about lessons that you've been learning from platforms like Steam and itch.io, and just the flood of indie games, and 10,000 games coming out in a year, and now giving more power and diversifying that space, and more people being able to make games. What's the role of the publisher there, and getting the word out about games? How do you rise above? How do you make yourself seen when there are 10,000 games, 20,000, 30,000 games coming out a year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still going to be a challenge always, right? Like, there's opportunity to create and participate that hasn't existed before, but like, there's still the eyeball problem, right? And that's the role that I think publishers and distributors still play. I think we just don't know yet as an industry what that's going to continue to evolve and look like, because the value proposition is different, right? You've got now, whether it's an individual that has access to things and developed a game that maybe they wouldn't have been able to in the past, or maybe it's started as a community around an idea. Now suddenly you have an IP that isn't starting from nothing. There's this really engaged and active community that is now coming to the developer with a value proposition. It just kind of flips the script on that. And that's not even just exclusive to gaming, right? Entertainment as a whole, I think, still has a lot of experimenting and learning to do to solve that problem. I think we'll continue to see new platforms, new models. You'll see existing players dip their toes in and out of the water, trying to figure out how to play in this space and capitalize on it. But as momentum picks up, I think we'll see all of those cycles just kind of play out like they always do. And there will be winners and losers. But ideally, the thing that results is that we have infrastructure that has advanced the space as a whole, and now we all have access, whether it's as players or consumers or creators, to experiences that we didn't have access to before.
Yeah, and I would say it reminds me of Unity's mantra, because that, and I've talked about them a lot, and obviously I think it's an extremely useful engine for education and for making games, and accessible, got a great support community, but it was really small when we first sort of got to know about it in 2005, 2006 or so is when I became aware of it. And so their mantra back then was to democratize 3D. And in many ways, like, it was a great mantra. They haven't always lived up to it, which is not surprising, maybe. But, it's a great mantra, and I think it's still something that we sense. We think games are triumphant right now, but they're only starting. Like, we have so much in front of us. But that democratizing notion, and I think that's part of what you're talking about, Joe, is that this distributed web can actually be a powerful democratizer of things, and not by necessity or essence an exploiter of people. Right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, whether even take it outside the context of gaming, right? Just to kind of hit on the kind of decentralized value of blockchain technology. We're talking about like high-speed broadband and access, which is I think everyone would agree, is a very critical infrastructure piece. There are networks and blockchains that are looking to create alternatives to T-Mobile and Sprint and your local IP providers by decentralizing the network and installing modules in homes and businesses, and then they pay you to broadcast that. Like, now, not only do I have access to something, but I'm getting paid to create that access for other people. Like, Cox is never going to do that for you, right? Like,
It's unlikely.
yeah, if they are, like, good for them. But I think that's the kind of thing that when you then layer on top of it all these other use cases for individual asset ownership and all the other things that it can do, that it gets really, really cool. And you start talking about like really true fundamental paradigm shifts and just how the whole economy around the space operates.
And I'm still, I think running parallel to this, I mean, it's a really exciting conversation, but the idea of publishing and supporting, smaller game developers like Causeway, like Gravity Turn, that's a really exciting space right now here at the ReWired Festival, because, I mean, there's great potential here for publishing in games. And I think one exciting opportunity could be setting up something like a game incubator between the university and some private interests, and helping folks get into the industry. I know I can only imagine how difficult it was to be pioneers in this Northwest Arkansas game development space. But if you had some money behind you, had expertise available, that's, I think, something like a ReWired Fest could set up an infrastructure that would make that possible.
No, I think that is exactly right, and a huge opportunity for us, for the festival, for U of A, and for the industry in Northwest Arkansas, because we certainly have the talent. Like, the kids are there with the talent, and it's sort of a question of give them a curriculum, right? A game design curriculum, game development curriculum, and also projects, because when you talk about sort of games, and it's not just a simple gamification of a thing, but like a brand experience that unfolds as an immersive game-like thing. Nobody quite knows what that is, like how that's going to unfold. And so that's kind of an experimental space, and I think there's a lot of value for industry here to have our students here exploring that possibility in that space. And it's not just, oh, I can fly around a Clorox bottle. Like, that wouldn't be so fun. But think of all the things that would be fun. Like, this is a huge, like, outdoor mountain biking thing. What if you could try out your bike on a virtual trail? Do you like its features? What if you wanted to know what these trails are like? Could that be a game experience, like a game engine? There are so many products that this story could, like, that their stories could be told in a 3D immersive way. If we could get kids involved in those kinds of projects, it's a win for industry because they're prototyping. And the tools are there now for rapid prototyping, like in Unity. And they don't. That's not your final product, but you got a kid involved. You got a team involved. They're not 18, 19, and now they're looped into the industry. And now they're also making educational content, right? We can go both ways with that. So it's, to me, there's like a huge potential there that sort of bounces back and forth and amplifies itself. So to me, anyhow, I'm super, as you probably can tell, like, as an educator, games were the most important thing, other than ancient Greek. Games were the most important thing that ever happened to me. And Tesseract was the most important thing that ever happened. So from personal experience, I can certainly speak to that. And that's possible, like, that can happen in a way larger way because we're in one of the retail centers of the universe. And that makes us different. We're one of the top 5 places to live. Right, so if you think of our advantages, and another thing we can plug in there is homegrown, creative 3D talent. So that to me is like a super, super big win. So at this, how are we doing time-wise?
We are
15.
Yep.
We got 15 minutes? Okay, so.
Might be questions.
Okay, I was about to turn in that direction. So it might be a good time now for us to welcome any questions you might have for us. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions.
Test. Let's stand up. Hi, my name is Dave Cox. I represent UNI Entertainment. We do a lot of business with Walmart. I want to talk about sports for a second, and again, it just ties into what you're saying, but when we look at Madden, probably back in our Quonset days of 82, 83,
Yeah.
how do you see, since sports is about 30, 35% of the gaming market, it's important to men and women. EA, I think, has taken a lot of great strides to open up the audience towards women, NBA, ladies soccer, et cetera. Where do you see the sports market go in 2, 3, 4 years? I'm just curious of your thoughts from a dev side, how that looks, how that landscape looks. Is it any different? I mean, how do you can change a jersey, an arena, a stadium, a roster, but Is it AI? Is it VR? I'm just kind of curious what you experts think about that. Thank you. And thank you for hosting this panel.
Oh, for sure. It's been super fun to talk about it. I'm going to see what you guys think about that question.
I mean, just a really quick, maybe very specific potential use case of things like that. When you think about whether it's virtual or augmented, you could do it either way. I think virtual is maybe a better example, but imagine being able to sell tickets to an event that maybe doesn't have a broad or very very supportive local market, but maybe does have a more distributed fan base. Now you can sell courtside seats to that, and I don't have to be there. I can experience that from home. I think that's one very specific example of how I think sports can start leveraging some of this technology in really interesting ways to, again, create opportunity to experience things that otherwise wouldn't happen, right? Maybe I don't have the money to buy a plane ticket and fly to wherever this is, but I can spend, whatever the cost of a ticket is. And now suddenly I've got this really, really cool experience that feels like I'm right there courtside or field side. Again, the super specific example, but I think that's one way to maybe think about how the technology can be applied in very accessible and practical ways.
It's sort of an off-the-wall answer, but I am the token classicist on the stage. And so what I would think about there is also like ancient gaming. Because, people have been playing games, athletic style games forever. And so if you could you have to be thoughtful about it, because like the ball game of like indigenous cultures in Mexico, South America, Central America, like that ball game was widespread and it had a lot of religious significance to it. But it'd be very interesting to recreate those past athletic experiences. And of course, there's the Olympics and that thing, but there's so many other forms of world gaming, right, that aren't Madden, that aren't NHL, which also I lost a whole lot. No, my son he was super good at that hockey game. And just at one point, he turned to me and said, the key here, Dad, is not to push all the buttons at once. Which tells you about my gaming skills. But I think that, to me, as a classicist and someone interested in telling stories of the past, imagine if we could create essentially esports, but esports with this sort of ancient flavor to them, taking you to those venues and those experiences. Then that becomes like another issue in sort of cultural diversity and education, right? So to me, I'd kind of maybe think about it in that route. Because it's super fun you're now this soccer player in this incredible in Wembley. What if you could be this other kind of sports player from the past? Like North America, like Native American games that we know were played in a certain way and had a certain significance. But again, are you like what's the indigenous like in terms of trade-off and ethics around that? Or you have to think about that. But I think that's a good thing for us to think about. Right? So I find that's a very good question. I think there actually is a lot of space yet unexplored because humans play so many sports. And not all of them are Titanic Madden, They don't have to be that. They can be past. They can be small. So. Pickleball. Oh my God. If we could get virtual pickleball like off the ground, you would make so many tennis players happy if you could do that.
Idea for the university.
Hello. Hi. I was really excited to hear more about your thoughts on history and video games because a lot of us, like Ubisoft uses Assassin's Creed to create storytelling. The most recent one plays on ancient Egypt, and you're able to see ancient Egypt in its purest form. So I wanted to hear more on your thoughts about, furthering education through these systems and these games. Do you think that will coincide with more educators coming into these universities as we're stepping more into creating that 3D interactive space? Like, we have a big push right now where we don't have a lot of teachers in middle school and high school, and a lot less people are less inclined to come into the educator space. So do you think with the improvement in gaming, more people stepping into gaming, especially historical games, would there be an increase in educators in these different spaces and academia?
Wow. Man, that is a great question. I would like to think very much so, yes. That is one of the ways of getting a kid interested in the past and other cultures and maybe learning about them, and that's the stepping stone to teaching them. Then I think historically based games can certainly do that. And again, it's like Ubisoft, they're super beautiful games, you know, but if you know the cultures involved, like, oh, they should have done this, you should have done that, you should have done that, right? And so you very much feel that, and I think that's part of like this connection between EA and Cologne. That, right, think about that. What if EA or Ubisoft, you know, we wanted to develop a game about indigenous or Native American culture, like we're right next to Oklahoma, right? What if we wanted to tell some, like we have these languages that are almost gone, right? And we wanted a way to sustain those cultures, those languages, those stories, and you partner with a game company, an Ubisoft or whatever, and they're now partnering with the U of A campus, so students are involved, indigenous students are involved. That's a very powerful circle, and I think you could build interest in education, because we are sort of in a crisis that way in terms of teachers. So no, that's a very good point. And I would certainly think as we integrate gaming into teaching teachers to teach, like as games become part of that, then I think that is a way to boost that profession.
Okay. So Jaleesa asked this beautiful, noble question. I have an ignoble question, maybe. 2 parts. So you were talking about the digital twins of things, and you gave some examples, which just led me to think about metaverse. So Meta recently came out with this really interesting commercial where they're showing that in the metaverse, at some point, you know, they could teach surgeons how to do surgery, which is this amazing, true, noble thing. So the first part of my question is, I'm really dying to know why no one in the metaverse has any legs. That's number 1. Number 2 is a little deeper, which is the other thing that I was thinking about was, you know, I think like Good Morning, whatever, one of the Good Morning shows did, like they went into the metaverse and they were exploring. And what they really found in the metaverse were people behaving very badly and inappropriately. And so then the other part of my question is really like, there's all these amazing things that can happen with this technology. How do we think about the dark side and the dangers of the technology, and how some of those technologies could really be used, you know, to hurt people? How do you work towards the good and try to keep out the bad?
That's a great question, and I'll maybe respond. I would love to hear what you all think too. I think as the resident Web3 and metaverse nerd, I actually think the way that we kind of think about and describe the metaverse today is completely stupid. You know, I think to your point about like, you know, hey, it enables all of these like kind of seedy, subversive things. Like that's always existed, right? Like the metaverse today is like what AOL chat rooms were back in the 90s. There's some gross people out there, and it's just a new medium for them to express that, right? We've created this concept of digital identities and you know, pseudonymity and anonymity, which are all like interesting and have their like very real applicability, but they're also very easy to take advantage of and manipulate. I don't know that that's a problem that is ever solved. I think it is a challenge that we will have to continue to work to solve. You know, as soon as you fix one problem, another one's going to pop up. Like that's not a job that's ever done. So I think as you know, as we think about what the concept of the metaverse is, I think it's virtual reality, it's augmented reality, it's consuming information. Like it's a concept, not a place. You know, and as for your first question about the legs, like see my first comment about the current state of the metaverse being stupid.
And I'd just like to quickly follow up by saying I hope you can come to my course in the spring. It's Humanities in the Metaverse, and I'd love to.
I would love to, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that the video that you're referring to and the ads around this, I follow Janet Murray, the media theorist here, and critiquing that in the following way, which is don't get excited about the spectacle, about the big promises. You know, design small and design with the medium in mind. And that's not going to take care of all of the crazy stuff that can happen out there, but that will be a better use of AR, VR, and the metaverses, because there will be many, than just saying, well, there's the technology. Those are things that we can now do. Let's get excited. Give us your money, right? Like that's not the right approach. It's what is a specific thing I can do in AR? What is the specific thing I can do in VR? Start there. Start small. Start with the medium in mind, and move back. Don't get caught up in all the spectacle.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about the missing legs, because I actually think there's a thing there, and that is, like in VR these days, do you really want your player to walk around? Their room is going to have to be quite large. Like they can only walk so far before they're running into the fridge or the dining table or whatever, what have you. And so a lot of it's puddle jumping, like you're pressing a button to jump to the next part of the world that's VR. Now it's weird if they give you legs and you can't walk, right? But this speaks to a fundamental thing in VR, and that is the question of the moving player, right? Because embodiment becomes so much more intense if you're actually moving that player around. So due to some questions of like proprioception, which like how your body knows where it is in space, and then nausea, right? So there's a lot of things behind those missing legs that are issues for VR to address. And I don't know if solve is the word, because otherwise you're in a large room or like a treadmill or something, right, for the player to be able to walk. On the other, because we've done some, on campus we have a thing that my colleague, Radora Venerucci, has worked on called Virtual Roman Retail, where she's like got people walking down an ancient Roman street to see how that street worked. Like how the ads and the fountains or, the paintings, everything spoke to them. And how did they react to that? But they can only walk like so far, right? Because we'd need like a 50-foot stretch of street. So there's that fundamental thing of the technology and where it is right now that's part of that leg issue.
Well, I think what you're hitting on, too, is a very interesting and fundamental question around augmented and virtual reality. And it's, are we taking advantage of what kind of new experiences that technology can create, or are we just trying to digitally replicate the world we live in today? I think the idea of showing up in these environments as a humanoid character, or avatar, or whatever, like there's a lot of very interesting and valid reasons to do that. Also, a lot of very interesting and valid experiences that would not require that. I think people that are focused on like solving that leg problem or maybe thinking about the problem a little too small. I saw a demo for, I'll avoid naming names, but a VR experience for, it was a brand that was experimenting in it, and they had a demo where you could kind of go around and do some stuff, and it was literally just like recreating a very analog experience of picking stuff up and looking at it, and there's an announcement of overhead about your like something being ready to go pick up. It's like, okay, I'm in a virtual space. Like, what am I going to go do? Walk to this counter and pick up my very real thing? Like, that's the wrong way to think about how we apply the technology, I think.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know if we have time for a final question or not, but yay. All right, Joshua Rowell, I'm Senior Manager and Lead Architect of Games for Learning in Walmart. So my question is about what would you like to see big companies doing to help support and grow? I know my vision is I would love to see high school students building games instead of PowerPoints, right? But like, what would y'all see? What do you want to see from big companies to help support this growth?
Wow, a really quick answer to that final question. I think, and I agree totally, PowerPoint is so awesome, but I agree that making games would be a better thing for high school kids to be doing. And I think especially high school to higher ed, if we could have, and students working on things that are meaningful. This is not, we're asking you to make a prototype right here for this, for instance, a shopping experience, and I agree with you totally. Like, we don't have to rebuild a Walmart in the virtual space in order to have an effective shopping experience. Like, there's so much more creativity you can do, drawing on games to do that, right? And so if we could explore some of that prototyping with high school, college students, mixing that, so there's a bridge between those students going to university with that skill set, and kids at the university polishing that skill set, right? And they know their products are going into a company like Walmart where they'll take one, now that's not it. Not, oh, no, that one, right? Because eventually those kids are going to make a thing that you want, right? And so if we can, and it doesn't have to be a huge money expenditure, right? And so, because the tools, like, you know, once you go commercial, it's different, but in an educational context, almost everything is free now, except the machine, you know? So it's really become so much more accessible, and that would be such a help. Because obviously, we would maybe be doing prototypes for retail, something like that, but we'd be having the same infrastructure that's the prototype or the game for history or for teaching language, that we've now got that infrastructure and students moving through it. That multiplies all the things we can touch with video games, and that would, man, that would be super incredible if we could do that.
I'd love to see a game incubator. I think that would be really, to build the industry here, right? And that's not just a space that graduates could move into, graduates of, say, like a game design program at the university, but it's where they could go to basically begin their startup. You know? So it's not just making the game, it's setting up the company.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
That's going to employ them and employ their friends, and places like Causeway and Gravity Turn are examples of what that looks like, to be a part of that, to grow even more of those and really get the industry going here in Northwest Arkansas and across the state. Some sort of incubation, I think.
No, that was really
cool.
key, Curtis, like from high school to university to startup around gaming technology. That was it.
And maybe just one final point, like in the context specifically of large organizations, it doesn't have to cost a lot, but financial support can be a huge thing, right? Like programs like Ignite at Bentonville are phenomenal. You know, partnering with programs like that exist, partnering with like indie developers to create new programs, you know, creating these incubators and accelerators that create equitable models that don't take all the equity away from, you know, the people doing the work long term and disincentivizing them and kind of giving all the upside to the corporation. You know, business is business, right? Like, it's got to make sense for everybody, but I think that is one very unique position that large companies are in that you know, smaller ones aren't, is to be able to support things like that in a more financially oriented way maybe than others.
Thank you. Thank you. So are we at time? Okay.
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Thanks, everybody.